So when we were going through the diagram of how a production fastboot setup would look, I made note that particularly if you're within the same data center, or maybe you're like within an AWS region where they have really fast connections between different, co-located buildings, retrieving data on the server side is cheap. Meaning if your fastboot server asks your API for data, that's happening really, really quickly. What we've learned in going through this exercise, just to get one piece of data, it's a little bit involved. There's a lot of switching. There are many different permutations you have to worry about. Are we server-side rendering or are we not? If we're server-side rendering, is what we're doing right now building HTML to serve up, or are we rendering in the browser, doing client-side rendering from there on out? So there are a lot of different things you have to worry about. The add-on I'd advise you use is called Ember Data Fastboot, and this basically means that if you're retrieving data through Ember Data, this will take care of it for you. It basically will capture all of the responses that you get and put those JSON API structures that they eventually get transformed into, that's not only a good JSON contract standard to use, but it is the internal representation of Ember data. It's how it is the target to which it normalizes everything. So it will store those structures in a shoebox store, and then as your app boots up in an initializer, it will shove that stuff into the store, doing this.store.push. So easy to install. It's really kind of a plug and play thing. You just add this, and you will notice that all of your data is just there. When you're using this, you kind of want to have an understanding of the different ways of getting data with Ember data. So there are 3 types of things you can do to retrieve. There's fetch, peek, and find. Fetch always makes a new API request. Peek will use whatever cached value you have in memory, or return nothing. It'll return null. Find will, by default, it will give you the cached data, any cached data it has immediately, but then do what's called a background reload, which basically means that if, say we've got one of these blog posts in our app, it will immediately return the thing that was left in the shoebox for you, and your render will complete. But it's also going to then go and hit the API and ask for that record again in case it may have changed since your information originally came over the wire. And if you get the same data back, there will be no re-render. But if you get new data back, it'll just be basically like the same effect as it will just trickle back through via data binding, via one-way data binding. So find is kind of what you want to use most of the time. And as soon as you look into the API surface of find, the options you can pass in, really you start to see that peek and fetch are just sugar on top of find with various options. So you can disable background reloading, or you can force skipping the cache. Basically, if you say reload true, you're saying no matter what, I want new data here. And if you say background reload false, that will essentially mean give me cache data or give me nothing. So understanding this and using Ember Data Fastboot, this is part of the path to making it so that you're as light on your API as you can be, while still being completely up to date with the data that you need to show on the screen. Background refresh in particular is really cool. It's just you're not waiting on it at all. It can take as long as it needs to take. And you might just see that if a spelling correction was made to a blog post, it'll sort of just pop in a second later. So I want to go on a little tangent here and talk about authentication, because we're going to start using the basic authentication setup I've left you with in this app. The main standard library that people try to use in Ember is called Ember Simple Auth. This is one of the libraries that's maintained by a consultancy called Simple Labs, based out of Munich. And this is like, if you can use SimpleAuth, it will save you a lot of time. If you have a need to build a new app and authentication is a problem you'd like a cleaner solution to, this is a really nice set of abstractions here. And it essentially gives you 4 building blocks, and you kind of implement these little tiny objects, each with a specific and well-scoped role. You implement them each yourself according to your needs. So you have an authenticator, which handles the particulars of like getting credentials. So in the case of this app, we have we're using the OAuth 2 password grant, convention, where we pass a username and a password to the API, and we get a JSON web token back, right? So the authenticator is the thing that handles that exchange and the means of fetching that token. The authorizer is what takes that token and it uses it in order to perform authenticated actions or to fetch authenticated data. So this, in our case, is what's going to add this as a header to each request that we're sending out to our API. So if you look at the headers, you'll see like bearer and then your JSON web token as the, as the authentication header. So you've got a session store, which just has to do with persisting that session and restoring it when the user comes back to that site. You can use local storage or a cookie or whatever you like. Important to remember that with server-side rendering, you really must use a cookie. Local storage data does not leave the browser, not unless you pluck it out and send it by some other means. So you want to be using a cookie there. And then finally, the session service. This is the main way of interacting with Ember SimpleAuth. So it's where you can get access to the JSON web token. It's where you can essentially log out and it will clear out all of its data. And it's mainly you're just working with the session service, and all of the other things are used as needed by SimpleAuth. So what we want to do, if we look at how things are working now, right, in this app, there's this little login button on the top right screen, corner of the screen. And if you go there, you'll see you can also go to a registration screen. So if you sign up, you'll see that you can subsequently log in. And if you're logged in, you'll see a request go out to retrieve information about the current user. So what we want to do is basically retrieve this current user object immediately after login, and probably when the application starts. If we are found to be authenticated, we want to go and get that data as well. So the bottom line is after you log in, you've gotten information about the current user shortly thereafter. And if you're returning as an existing user and you have a valid token, you want to be able to do that as well. You want to be able to fetch that as part of the app starting up.